Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. There are, of course, Mr. President, two issues before the Senate with respect to Judge Neil Gorsuch. The first issue is simply, should or should not Neil Gorsuch be confirmed as an Associate Justice to the United States Supreme Court? But there's also a second issue. And the second issue is, should the Senate even be allowed to vote? Those two questions are both important and they're interrelated. I want to talk about the first one first. I sit on the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Chairman. We heard last week, 2 weeks ago, about 20 hours of testimony from Judge Gorsuch. I think he answered about 200 questions in writing. One of the objections offered by our friends on the other side of the aisle, the Democratic Party, is that Judge Gorsuch refused to answer some of the questions. Now, that's just not accurate. Many of the questions that were asked of the judge, both by Democrats and Republicans, were fair questions. Some of them, not so much, Mr. President. Judge Gorsuch was asked, in effect, what's your position on abortion? How will you vote? He was asked, how will you vote on gun control? He was asked, how would you vote on cruel and unusual punishment, the Eighth Amendment? He was asked how he would vote on questions dealing with the 10th Amendment. And he didn't answer those questions. And then he was criticized for not answering those questions. He didn't answer those questions, Mr. President, because he couldn't. He's a sitting judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. Let me read to you, Mr. President, Canon 3A6 of the Code of Conduct for United States Judges. It states, quote, a judge should not make public comment on the merits of a matter pending or impending in any court, end quote. Let me read you, Mr. President, Rule 2.10b of the American Bar Association Model Code of Judicial Conduct. It provides, and I quote, Mr. President, a judge shall not, in connection with cases, controversies, or issues that are likely to come before the court, make pledges, make promises, or make commitments that are inconsistent with the impartial performance of the adjudicative duties of the judicial office. Now, say what you want about Judge Gorsuch, but don't criticize him for not violating the oath of his office and not making promises or pledges or commitments like a politician on how he would vote on the United States Supreme Court, because justices are supposed to decide the case on the merits. Now, as I mentioned, Mr. President, I watched Judge Gorsuch answer questions personally for over 20 hours. And he was asked some other questions other than the ones I've referenced. And I was intrigued by some of the questions that Judge Gorsuch was asked. My friends in the Democratic Party kept trying to draw distinctions with Judge Gorsuch between the parties in cases that he had decided. My friends kept talking about the big guy, the little guy, the corporation, the consumer, the employer, the employee, and the suggestion was made that Judge Gorsuch, he didn't vote enough for the little guy or the little gal, or whatever that means. And what struck me when he was asked these questions is that what we were supposed to be talking about, Mr. President, was the faithful application of justice. Now, I was taught in law school that justice, Lady Justice, is supposed to be blind, that neither the wealth nor the power nor the status of the parties should matter. That's why the picture that we see so often of Lady Justice, she's blindfolded. She isn't looking at the parties at all to see whether they're wealthy or not so wealthy. She isn't looking at the parties to see whether they're a corporation or a consumer or what race they are or what gender they are or what part of the country they're from. Lady Justice is supposed to be blind because we're a nation of laws, not men. And of all places in our country, an American court of law, and I'm very proud of this, is supposed to be the place of last resort where you can come and get a fair shake. And that's how good judges operate. They give everybody a fair shake. A good judge is supposed to make his or her decisions based on the law, not the parties. Good judges are supposed to be impartial, to call it like they see it, to call the balls and strikes, and that's exactly what Neil Gorsuch has done throughout his entire career. And I promise you, Mr. President, I sit on the Judiciary Committee. And if any president, whether he is a Republican or a Democrat, ever brings a nomination before Judiciary Committee when I'm on that committee, and that nominee starts talking about the wealth or the status or the power of the parties and how it will influence or not influence his decisions, suggesting that that will make a difference, I will vote against that nominee. I don't care who nominates him every single time, because that's not American justice. Mr. President, we talked about two cases in particular, and you've probably heard them talked about here on the floor. And on the surface, they don't seem to be related. Judge Gorsuch ruled in both of these cases, but I think they interact in a very important way, and they tell us a lot about the man. They tell us that he doesn't play politics. He doesn't rule for the big guy just because he's a big guy, or the little guy just because he's a little guy. The first case we heard a lot about was a decision by Judge Gorsuch in a case called Trans Am Trucking. You're going to hear a lot about that case. Now, in that case, Judge Gorsuch made a decision that was unfavorable to a trucker, and he ruled in favor of the trucking company. Little guy versus big guy. And Judge Gorsuch ruled for the big guy. But it's important, Mr. President, to know why. To look at the reasoning in that case and not just the result. During the discussion on the case, Judge Gorsuch made it very clear that he only made that decision because he believed that that was what the statute controlling the facts of the case required. A statute that was passed by a legislative body, duly authorized by the people to make the law, unlike our courts, which are supposed to interpret the law. Judge Gorsuch did not decide that case the way he did because he didn't sympathize with the trucker. He decided that case the way he did because he was doing his best to accurately apply the law as best he understood it to the facts before him. Once again, that's what's called justice, blind to the parties. And actually, Judge Gorsuch explained himself what he thinks about decisions like this. He did it in another case that I will talk about in a moment. Let me read his direct quote. This is what Judge Gorsuch said. Quote, often the law can be an ass, an idiot. Quoting, of course, Charles Dickens. And there is little we judges can do about it. For it is, or should be, emphatically our job to apply, not rewrite the law enacted by the people's representatives. Indeed, a judge who likes every result he reaches is very likely a bad judge, reaching for results he prefers rather than those the law compels. Now, that statement, Mr. President, came from the second case I referenced. It was a case called A.M. Holmes. In A.M. Holmes, a 13-year-old seventh grader was arrested for fake burping repeatedly in class. Now, the majority said it was okay for him to be arrested and that when his family sued the police officer enjoyed qualified immunity. Judge Gorsuch dissented. This time he ruled for the little guy, literally and figuratively. Judge Gorsuch said, in my opinion, reading the statutes passed by the legislature, this young man's family can file this lawsuit because disciplining a 13-year-old seventh grader for fake burping in class by arresting him instead of disciplining him is a bridge too far. Now, once again, we had a little guy versus a big guy. This time, Judge Gorsuch ruled for the little guy. But again, we have to look at beyond the result, Mr. President. Even though he ruled for someone we can all sympathize with, Judge Gorsuch didn't base his decision on that. He based it on a good faith application of the statutes controlling the facts of the case. He applied the law as written by the legislature. That's what legislatures do, Mr. President. That's what Congresses do. They make law, and judges interpret the law. And to be blunt, Mr. President, that's what we want in a judge. I want a judge. I don't want an ideologue. I'm not interested in a judge who will use the judiciary to advance his own personal policy goals. I want a judge, Mr. President, who will apply the law as written by the legislature, or in the case of the Constitution, as written by the framers of the Constitution, as best that judge understands the law, not to try to reshape the law as he wishes it to be. Mr. President, just a comment about the last question that I raised earlier. Again, one issue is whether or not we should confirm Judge Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. But the second issue is whether the Senate should even be allowed to vote at all. And that's what this is all about when you distill it down to its basic essence. We're going to hear a lot about cloture, and we're going to hear a lot about the nuclear option. But this is what it boils down to. Should we or should we not even be able to allow to vote? Now, I understand that reasonable people can disagree. I also understand that unreasonable people can disagree. And everybody in this body has a vote. And we all represent states. There are 2 senators from every state, big states and little states. And everybody is entitled to be able to vote his or her conscience. But it is very, very important, not only for the American judicial system, but for American democracy, that the United States Senate be allowed to vote on Judge Gorsuch. And so, to my friends on the other side of the aisle, I would say, please allow us to vote. Please, you can vote for or against Judge Gorsuch. I won't second guess your judgment if you act sincerely, and I believe many of my colleagues are sincere. They're wrong, but they're sincere. But please allow the United States Senate to vote on this nomination. That's why I was sent to Washington, Mr. President. I yield.